Good morning and welcome back again. I'm Laurens Cerulis. I'm Senior Policy Reporter at POLITICO, covering technology and cybersecurity issues. I'm here to moderate the second discussion of this morning, which looks at the national implementation of artificial intelligence, how our companies and how our sectors and governments using artificial intelligence nationally to catch up with the race on technology across Europe. And for that, I've got three superbly qualified speakers from across Europe, namely three members of European governments to discuss this issue with me, which I would like to welcome on stage here in Brussels, but also online from other parts of Europe. First of all, welcome Philippe de Backer. You are Minister of Digital Affairs in Belgium. You are still Minister of Digital Affairs in Belgium?
Yes, still 15 minutes.
Exactly. So thank you a lot for joining us as your last duty on the role. And online we've got Mona Keizer from the Netherlands, who is State Secretary for Economic Affairs, joining us. And we have Manuel Heitor, Minister of Science and Technology, joining us from Portugal. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us for this discussion.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning, thank you very much.
If you don't mind, Minister de Backer, I'm gonna start with you, just because it's a very special day with you, for you. Are you still Minister for Digital Affairs?
At this moment, yes, but at 10 o'clock the new government will take sermon, and so we have a new Liberal Prime Minister with Alexander De Croo. And so my duties will transfer at 10 o'clock to another minister. They had to find, I think, 4 different ones to deal with all my different competences, but it's, I think, the first time that you have a live stream where live on stage a minister is no longer a minister in 15 minutes. So
we'll make use of the 15 minutes that we have, and then obviously afterwards you can speak freely, of course.
I always speak freely.
So let me just ask you first, so looking at the Belgian government that's now taking office this morning, how confident are you that it will be a continuation of what you've done on the job on digital affairs and on artificial intelligence?
I'm pretty sure. For the first of all, I think Alexander De Croo was my predecessor on the Department of Digital Affairs, so I think he's very knowledgeable. And I also see in the government accord really all the elements to modernize, to digitalize further the Belgian government, but also a big impetus also to companies, SMEs, to really make use of the digitalization. Also, the rollout of 5G is a priority for the new government. So there are lots of elements in there that I see that are really a continuation of the policies that we have set over the last couple of years. So I'm really, really confident that these policies will go on in Belgium, and that Belgium will and remain also a front runner when it comes to digital agenda.
Well, thank you for that. And Ms. Keizer, if I can bring you in, if we start looking at national implementation of what's happened at the European level on artificial intelligence. We've had a white paper from the European Commission that talks about ethics in AI. It talks about boosting the European market based on standards and ethics and values. How are you turning that into reality in the Netherlands right now?
Okay. We welcome the white paper on AI by the European Commission. To start with, it sets some good standards. It's important that whatever we do, it's excellent and that people can trust it. And when you say trust, what I mean is that people can be sure that their rights and important European values are the basis on which AI is developed. And there are some examples from the past months, years, where we see that it's important to every time realize that what you're doing in the digital world should be on the same condition that we accept things that happen in the analog world. For instance, Amazon had a recruitment application where unintended was shown that when you don't really think about the bias, which is part of all of us, that it's being put into an algorithm, then you can be sure that the outcome isn't a good one. This application favored men over women. So it's an unintended, but it's important to realize this, because when you say Human-centric AI, you have to be specific about what do you mean. Well, that's in general when you talk about AI. In the Netherlands, we think it's important that there's a learning approach, that you don't ban to start with things that may be very interesting when it develops, but that you really look into what can be a problem. I know that some part of policy and some people come up with high risk sectors. And it's important every time to go to dive into the different sectors. For instance, autonomous driving is completely different when you do it in secluded places, like for instance the Rotterdam Harbour, or when it's a part of the public streets. So those are things that I think are important. And talk about AI, people who have time to watch Netflix may have noticed the new Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. And of course, when they say the documentary and when you look at it, well, it's a little bit dramatized, of course, but it's very important to realize that people will come up with the question, what does AI with me and with my life? So we all have to realize that this is part of the discussion. And when you want to have excellent AI, it means investing. And when you want people to trust AI, it means that you have to address this kind of questions.
If I may follow up just once, because you mentioned Amazon as an example of where this is an issue, and you talk about the learning approach. What's been your conversation with Amazon, and do you think Amazon and perhaps other countries are actually learning that this is an issue?
Well, I think they do. What I understood is that they took down this application and altered it. So this is one of the examples where we learn every day. In the Netherlands, let me see. There is also there are great developments when you look at what AI can mean. There is our national police is experimenting with AI to help resolve cold cases. It's an AI tool that searches forensic traces and new possibilities with those traces. Well, this is where we can learn with AI and from AI to solve big societal questions, of course. So the learning approach is that realizing that it can really help us, AI, but learning approach also means not banning to start with some applications of AI, but every time ask yourself the question, what we think is normal and acceptable in the analog world should be in place in the digital world. And then every time, step by step, altering your policy, and at a certain point come up with legislation when necessary. For instance, liability or GDPR or rules on advertising are in place in the analog world. Well, then it should be in place in the digital world too. In the Netherlands, but I think it's even European legislation, we think it's inappropriate to have some kind of advertisements during the daytime to protect our children. Well, why isn't it in place in the digital world, for instance, on YouTube? Those are the questions we have to ask ourselves, and then not smashing innovation and research and development with rules, but every time asking yourself, what's the problem and how do we solve it?
Minister Heiter, if I can bring you in here, I think Ms. Keizer is speaking about values and about how to use AI in a sort of human-centric way. This is also something that's often mentioned at European level, that this would be our advantage. Can I just get your thoughts on that? To what extent do you think this human-centric approach can actually be an advantage? And I don't mean only from an ethical perspective, because obviously that would be an obvious answer, but also economically. How can artificial intelligence in Europe really benefit in terms of its competitiveness with other parts of the world from this approach?
Good morning, and thank you very much for this opportunity. This is a very timely question, and I will try to answer in four main lines of action that we have been following more and more, certainly in a pan-European context, but very much at a national level. First and foremost, in a system which is particularly based on SMEs, and where SMEs do play a critical role in economic development, and among many other European regions and countries, the innovation ecosystems of Portugal is fully based on SMEs. The first target was to articulate SMEs, particularly towards consortium and missions focus on their growth and certainly on the economic development. And this has been used in Portugal and elsewhere, making use of mobilizing projects through the use of structural funds. Areas which range from the use of space-driven image for environmental purposes or for urban mobility in cities, particularly bringing together consortium of SMEs so that we provide critical mass, which is critical, again, for economic development and in a human-centric way, also to think in all of those that work in SMEs, which is the majority of the labor force. Second, to consider this consortium in a pan-European context, particularly making use of European tools such as the Horizon 2020 and for instance, the development of platforms, particularly during the COVID-19 crisis, to make sure that we engage consortium for digital health hubs, making use of AI tools and to share methods, but also test beds at an European level has been particularly important. Third, I will put with a great emphasis that in order to use AI, you need robust data. And these data sets are essentially of public nature, and they are particularly owned and managed by public administration. So in Portugal, we set up over the last 2 years a major task force to involve public administration with research centers, making use of AI tools, certainly to build capacity in public administration, but again, to have a user-centric approach to AI with public administration. Examples are in the health sector, for instance, to reduce the prescription of antibiotics or to improve cancer treatments by exchanging and processing tumor image, but also in the consumer protection for reduction of accidents in traffic-driven issues, or particularly for food safety and many other areas where public administration do provide the necessary and do have the necessary data that can be processed with AI in a user-centered approach. Fourth, but last but not least, we need to clearly understand that the use of AI has been the result of more than 60 years of development, but it continues to require future developments. One of the major issues we have done in Portugal, again in a pan-European context, was the installation of advanced computing facilities, particularly under the European Aero HPC area, because the preparation of the next decade AI, again in a user-driven approach, do require increased advanced computing facilities, and therefore we need to train our researchers, but essentially our SMEs to better use advanced computer. And again, through the EuroHPC, that has been a major task force in Portugal. We have nowadays a supercomputer running, being used by a quite diversified set of SMEs, research centers, technology centers, in the public administration, and this has been a major task force, again, to really provide a user-centric approach to AI.
Thank you. If I may just remind the audience at home as well that you can ask questions. We've got one in now, which we'll pick up later in the discussion. You can ask questions on our events app, the Politico events app, and there's also a poll out where you can vote, a multiple choice question where you can vote that we will discuss and look at the results later. Let me just read out the poll real quickly so you can go and look at that on the events app. The question is, how has the pandemic changed Europe's race to catch up on artificial intelligence? That is the coronavirus pandemic. Choice 1, it has made it harder to compete because of the economic challenges. 2, it has made it easier because it is boosting digitization and unlocking new recovery funding. Or 3, it hasn't changed the underlying challenges Europe has compared to other parts of the world, like investment issues and a more fragmented market. You can go and pick your choice there online, but it also brings us to the next part of this discussion, I think, which is about money. Because if we're talking about artificial intelligence development, a lot of the challenges that Europe is facing is about investment, and it's about finding the right money to pour into our ecosystem of companies. So maybe, Minister De Backer, if I can start with you. How are you, for instance, within Belgium, managing to unlock new funding? If we look at private investment, for instance, because we all know the public investment part is a little bit tricky and there's always little money to invest.
There are different things. We, of course, looking at AI specifically, we started AI for Belgium a couple of years ago. And so we brought together already all the expertise that was present in Belgium or even from Belgians abroad. People working at MIT, Harvard, their expertise was brought in. We brought together the public and the private sector in different areas to really find out where in Belgium we could really build small ecosystems around specific topics. And so that was actually a first step because it allows you to bring all the competences, all the knowledge, all the data that's also available together to really start building business cases. And the private sector responded quite well to that because when we launched AI for Belgium, we at the same time also launched a private investment fund of over 100 million euros to be able to invest in the projects coming out of that. And so I think that money as such is not a problem. I think that we need a very clear and transparent regulatory framework, which is still being built up at the European level. Look at the white paper, for example. You need to implement that right now. And indeed, the fragmentation is still an issue because what I see as a main challenge for Europe is that finding the funding for the first million, the first 5 million, even the first 10 million is not that difficult. There are funds in the European Commission, there are funds in national governments, and there are private funds. But taking the next step, really building a business model which allows you to not only go and conquer your own country, but Europe or internationally, there you often need some more funding. And that fragmentation is really working against that. So it's a problem that's not only typically for AI or digital applications, but it's also in biotech industry and other sectors where innovation sometimes is slowed down. Secondly, and picking in on the first topic, we always tend to look at some of the dangers with new technology in Europe. And that's always the first question that's asked. What are the problems? What are the caveats? Why is digital different from analog? But what I often see in other countries who are really spearheading today AI is the question, what are the opportunities? How is this going to change society? How is this going to improve the lives of people? And the corona crisis is actually quite a good example. When the corona hit in Belgium, we brought together the expertise present within AI for Belgium, for example, to see if we could set up programs for drug development, vaccine development, and some information came out of that. We used immediately some of the data that was available in government and in private companies to see how the virus was spreading in Belgium. And so we could monitor and and predict also based on AI models how the virus would spread based on, for example, mobility corridors, the behavior of people. So it clearly showed from the start that AI does have an impact also in moments of crisis, and that by scrambling together the resources that you have, the knowledge that you have, the expertise that you have in your country, but also Europe-wide, that can really have a big impact. And so that, for me, would be the call to different national governments, but also to the European Commission, is to really try to invest in that, build those ecosystems, build those connections between people and industries, because the really interesting things in AI are really happening on the crossroads of different sectors.
I'm going to bring in our two speakers online on that issue, because we've said it, the pandemic and recovery funding, that's going to be dominating discussions around funding, both privately and publicly in coming years. So let me just ask for you, State Secretary Keizer, if you can tell me, what do you expect from the EU's plans to use the recovery funding to boost digitization as well as the green economy? Do you really expect this? To what extent do you expect this to help or even speed up artificial intelligence development in the Netherlands?
Well, when you look at the Netherlands, last year, 2019, we invested 64 million euros in AI, and this year an additional 23.5 million. But that's not all of it. We've got a national growth fund which has 20 billion for the next 5 years in it, and I expect AI programs to be part of this. So we are investing for the Dutch considerably in AI, and I believe that's very important because and that's why I always talk about examples to explain why. Because if I don't, I just come up with some figures, and what does it say? But when you look at the COVID pandemic and what is happening to our society, it's very important to realize that digital techniques and AI can be a solution. We all experience social distancing at the moment. And that's one of the reasons why we are not in Brussels in the same room with you now. And of course, that's important to do, but it's also very important to look into on what kind of conditions you can come together again. Because we are social human beings, and being together sparks innovation and sparks new ideas. Well, in the Netherlands, I think it's 3 weeks ago, we had a smart distance lab. It was an experiment for an art fair to actually take place. Well, that's one of the events that can take place again using digital techniques and using AI. But there's also in the Netherlands let me see, the use of data-driven digital techniques is used to estimate the disease progressions of patients and to identify the affected lung tissue of potentially infected persons. That's one of the great examples what AI can achieve, what digital techniques can achieve. So that's why it's important to invest, and that's what we are doing. And the Recovery and Resilience Funds of the European Commission, 20% of it has to be on digital. So I think it's a very wise thing to do. So I'm very happy with the European Commission, who also realizes the importance of this kind of techniques and the importance of investing in it.
Thank you. And Minister Heiter, if I can bring you in, how do you expect the impact of the pandemic? Because the economy is going to take a big hit. So the question is going to be, are we going to come out of this stronger, or are we going to have a delay in our plans as we had them before?
It is clear that this has become a throughout the discussion, and a very relevant discussion. But I will recall 2 topics. First is certainly the need to articulate funds. The recovery plan is a huge amount of funds that needs to be articulated with other European structural funds and also the European centralized funds such as Horizon Europe, beyond the national public and private funding. And so the major trick in our view and what has been done is particularly to try to better articulate the way people at large and companies in particular can access in an articulated way to these various sources of funding. But let me now focus on the pandemics again under two major topics. First is that the pandemics and the COVID-19 has particularly accelerated the awareness that we live and we will live further and further in a data-driven society. And in a data-driven society, you have to have access to data, but you need to process and transform data in social and economic value. And this can only be done with advanced data processing systems where artificial intelligence, among many other issues associated with machine learning and data science at large, are critical to every single SME to grow or large companies. My second point is very much that we certainly need to look at the consequence of pandemic, but we also need to look more and more at the grassroots and the causes, what have caused this pandemic, because that will allow us to look at the future. We will have future pandemics and future viruses. And at the end, we know that this pandemics has passed from animals to man and has been a consequence of a lack of equilibrium between human and economic activities and the planet Earth. That is the reason why the use of digital technologies with the so-called European Green Deal are so important, because we need definitely to look at a new balance between economic activities and the planet Earth. In this area, the use of AI, particularly combined with satellite-driven image for urban life, for the register of the territory, for agriculture and precision agriculture, for every single activity, we will have to use more and more image which are taken by low altitude satellites and combined with AI to really help driving our activity in a more balanced way. And this will be the only way to prevent future pandemics, because we need to understand that the causes of the COVID-19 are particularly associated with the increased impact of so-called zoonotic diseases, which have been the result of an imbalance between the economic activity and our planet Earth. And again, AI will be critical for the coming decades to find a better balance if we combine with a new set of observation methods.
Thank you. Let me just bring in a question from our audience, because it ties into this before we go into discussion around the international dimension and the competition with other parts of the world. So we've got a question from Anonymous. And in this case, the question is, SMEs were mentioned a number of times in the discussion. How do we avoid micro and family-owned SMEs from falling behind? I think this is a very relevant question, because Europe is full of SMEs. It's riddled with SMEs. So let's ask perhaps Minister De Backer.
Well, it's called entrepreneurship. Also SMEs, be it family-owned or otherwise, need to understand what is going on in their part of the market and try to find for new innovative solutions and make use of the AI that is available to see if they can take a head start in their own sector. So it's called entrepreneurship. First of all, what I've seen today is, for example, that in the beginning of the crisis, we had across Europe a lot of problem with testing, and it were SMEs who were coming up with the solutions. It were SMEs who were developing new test kits. It were SMEs who were developing new technologies. For example, there are two companies, Ecometrics and RoboVision, who developed a technology based on CT scans to determine whether a patient was infected and what stage it was in, and so to allow hospitals to really take quick decisions. It were SMEs who already did that. It was not the big... No, and so we pushed them, of course, and we were in contact with them, and we allowed them to have access to data, and so we could facilitate certain things, but it were they and their entrepreneurship and their insights who came up with the ideas. And so I think in that respect, I think that from the government side, again, what we can do is to offer a landscape, to offer the ecosystem. That's why we started AI for Belgium, because a lot of these people don't know each other. A lot of those people don't understand what they can learn from each other. But by organizing these kind of events, by making this information available, and of course sometimes also putting some innovative money into it, it allows them to develop much quicker. But in the end, it is down to entrepreneurship, to understanding your business, your sector, and to see how AI can have either an added value for your business, or at least be aware of the threats that are coming out of AI to your current business model. And so I think there, again, sharing that kind of information, stimulating to have a look at that and sharing that knowledge, I think will help also family-owned SMEs to continue to grow. But what I see today is that most of those SMEs are already at the spear point and at the forefront of what's going on.
Obviously, the early development of AI also relied on big data sets, and a lot of data. I think that's where it originated. Let me just ask Ms. Keizer, is it a problem that, for instance, that we pour money into SMEs which perhaps don't have the same access to big data or to data than, say, big tech or large technology firms have? And how do you see this being solved at the European level when it comes to data sharing and making sure that SMEs and other smaller companies, startups, etc., actually have access to the data?
Well, thank you very much. I tried to intervene, but I'm not sure if you heard me, because I would really like to comment on the question you asked, Philip, about SMEs. I know that I understand that when outside of the Netherlands, people are talking about going Dutch, it means bringing your own meal to a party. But in the Netherlands, going Dutch, it means public-private partnerships. And there's a really particular Dutch way in doing things. It means that when in the Netherlands, I think it's almost a year ago, the national AI action agenda or action program was being made, it was really a cooperation between governments, knowledge institutes, university, companies, big and small, who came up with a national agenda. And when we invest in AI, we find it very important. It's also part of our top sector and innovation policy that big companies work together with smaller companies. And your question you asked, when I listen carefully, you could think that you mean that when you invest in bigger companies, you get more out of it when you invest in smaller companies. And I don't believe that. Philip just mentioned SMEs in the digital world who are very, very successful. So I really believe that it's important that going Dutch doesn't mean, in the future, doesn't mean bringing your own food or drinks to a party. It really means cooperating with all those different entities I just mentioned, and not thinking that big is always beautiful and is always effective. The cooperation between everyone who wants to be part of this development and wants to invest and wants to make sure that we in Europe and in the Netherlands are part of the AI economy and the digital economy in the future, should be able to cooperate.
Great.
Cooperate.
Mr. Heiter, if I can bring you in on the international dimension, I think a lot of the discussion in Europe on artificial intelligence, we often look at ourselves as, as challenged by China and the US, where most of the technology is coming from. In the case of Portugal, I think there's an interesting dimension of Chinese cooperation because of investment that's very important to your country. So how do you look at that? How do you see, for instance, the importance, but also the challenges of Chinese investment into Portuguese technology when it comes to AI?
That context that you address on Chinese investment has been particularly in a specific sector, particularly in the energy sector, and it is not through SMEs, it is particularly to large companies. And again, we are and we should strengthen our European DNA, and that is our positioning in the world. But again, we have also been able to understand Europe as an open world to cooperation, with Africa, to transatlantic cooperation, and to cooperation with Asia. And again, the way to look at the unbalance of populations we have in Europe at large, 400 million people, which compare to 1.4 billion in China, and therefore we need to definitely understand how can we cooperate for the sustainable development of our future generations. And again, Europe is certainly the best place in the world for people who live. And this is our role, to pass to next generations, that Europe continues to be the best place in the world for people to live, to have access to a freedom world, a freedom of ideas, where actually SMEs are not a problem. We should be proud of our SMEs because they are a unique source of innovation in the European ecosystem. Again, the key issue for Europe is to facilitate SMEs, at least some of them, to grow. And this will require more and more the articulation of the internal market in Europe. Again, the growth of at least some SMEs at a level that can really impact social and economic development will depend on the way we articulate our European internal market, and particularly the data policy, in order to better use AI through SMEs for the impact of population at large. We see this as a key issue in the tomorrow's industry, which will be more automated, more data-driven, but essentially on environmental issues, where again Europe is leading, and we should certainly remember this in the tomorrow's planet. When we look at advanced sustainable technologies, Europe is leading the process of a better integrating new technologies in a greening of our economic development. What can be done in the hydrogen sector in the years to come, what has been done in the integration of, again, satellite data for Earth observations with AI technologies. And these rely very much on the European SMEs and on very innovative SMEs. The key to find and to articulate funds for their growth is certainly one of our challenges for the years to come, but always in an open environment.
Thank you, Minister. So let me just bring in one final question from our audience. We have about 5 minutes left, which we're gonna because this question actually relates to what we were just talking about. Plus, it has the added benefit of being not from anonymous, but from Roger de Keersmaker, who is an executive advisor at IMEC, a innovation center. Minister De Backer knows very well, is based in Belgium, in Leuven. The question is: there is a lot of attention for regulation and ethics, and rightly so. But gathering and handling industrial data is vital for our economy, but it will require huge infrastructure where we risk being dependent on the US and or on China. So what are we doing to mitigate this risk of being dependent in terms of infrastructure? Let me pose a question to you because it's from IMEC.
Yeah, I know. IMEC is a world-leading institute in Leuven. I try to visit once a year to be up to speed with what's going on. They also played, for example, a big role also in some of the testing innovations that we did. So Roger, of course, knows the situation very well. And the question is actually a very good question, because I think indeed that we have to still continue to look for the gaps that we have in the European system. And so infrastructure is one of them. IMEC is a chip producer, I think also world-class and leading in it. So I think that we have to really start looking for where are the gaps. And what I see as a couple of challenges is, one, indeed the question that Roger is asking, the basic infrastructure, so supercomputing, but also other elements that we really take a harsh look at to see where do we need together invest more. A second challenge that I see is that the fear of overregulation. We have a lot of debates about ethics, which is good. We have a lot of discussions about regulation, which is okay. But in the end, if we are not doing it, we're not going to be able to claim the innovation. So I would really plea here for a European principle-based approach, where you say you implement certain standards and don't overregulate or micro-regulate and allow innovation to spawn. And the last point, of course, is data ownership. With AI comes also the question of data ownership, and we have always said that within GDPR, but also as a conceptual framework, we are working with a person who is owner of its data, and I still fully support that, but it poses certain challenges when it comes to AI, not so much in an industrial context, but more in a personalized context. And so I think those are three critical challenges that Europe together will need to fix and solve and create a framework for in order to really allow AI to thrive in Europe.
Great. Ms. Keizer, if you want to come in on that element of infrastructure and dependency, what's your take on that from the Netherlands?
Well, when you look at ownership of data, I think that's one of the issues at hand, because me being in charge of my data doesn't help when big platforms just use it like they see fit. So it really also comes to the question, what do they do with them? And that's about the way the platforms are being constructed, how they earn money, for instance. So that's a difficult issue where every time when you don't want to smash innovation, again, like I mentioned before, but on the other hand, we need to regulate in some way, because if people don't trust it, they won't use it. So that's important. In the Netherlands, I just talked about the Dutch way, the public-private partnership. We also have in Netherlands a data sharing coalition in place, where big companies are working together as we speak on sharing data. And that's important to make sure we can compete with companies from other parts of the world. So the Gaia X initiative from Germany and France is also a very good example, and I'm looking closely into it and to find out how we can cooperate with them. There's also a French-Canadian cooperation in place, and I believe that we have to work together, cooperate with each other, to make sure that Europe is big in comparison to other parts of the world. Because if we don't, then the techniques will come into Europe from those parts of the world. And I'm not sure it's aligned with the way we want the digital economy, the digital society has aligned with the way it should work from our point of view.
I think we're going to have to wrap up our discussion on artificial intelligence here, but just because we can, I would like to ask you one more last question, Minister De Backer, in your capacity as minister, which ended about 30 minutes ago, but still. In the new Belgian government plan, there is the promise of introducing a digital tax by 2023. If nothing happens at the international stage. That's the caveat. So how do you feel about that? And did you whisper that into the ear of our new Prime Minister?
I think that Alexander also in the past already pushed for this also at the European level, and I think it's really something that we need to do in an international context. I don't like these kind of taxes when it comes to purely national ones, so let's hope that we can find a solution at the European level to also create a level playing field between indeed the larger foreign companies, the European SMEs, because I think also working in this way, it helps to create this level playing field and to allow these companies to also make a contribution to the impact they have on society.
But it's quite a move to announce it in 3 years' time if nothing happens, right?
Yeah, sometimes as politics, you have to announce something before it happens. So let's see how it goes.
Great. Well, State Secretary, Minister, and Minister here in Brussels with me, I would like to thank you all for a wonderful discussion. And in about 10 minutes' time, just under 10 minutes' time, my colleague Mark Scott will take over for an interview with the UK's State Secretary for Digital Affairs, Oliver Dowden. Stay tuned. Thank you.